Our next focus segment is on the new search for Josef Mengele, the Nazi angel of death who murdered thousands of people in World War II. Judy Woodruff has the background. Judy?
Jim, it was Mengele who was behind many gruesome medical experiments done in Nazi death camps. He avoided capture after the war ended and made his way eventually to South America. But it wasn't until just a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. Justice Department got involved in the effort to locate Mengele and to bring him to trial. American interest arose after evidence came to light that Mengele might have escaped from a U.S. prison camp in Germany. Today, the U.S. Congress got into the act with members of a Senate subcommittee imploring the U.S. government to do all it can to find Mengele.
Mr. Chairman, when we talk to the various intelligence agencies and officers and people who are knowledgeable, there's no doubt that, number one, that this monster Mengele is alive. There's no doubt in my mind that if we in the United States of America had him in custody, and I believe that facts that the Army is now checking out in terms of Ida Oberstein and who took over and what happened to Mengele, that we have a moral responsibility greater than ever to make a very real concerted effort at bringing him to justice.
This morning, a leading U.S. Nazi hunter told members of the Senate subcommittee why the search for Mengele goes on 40 years later. And two of his victims who survived Auschwitz recalled the brutalities he perpetrated.
We arrive in Auschwitz, beaten out of the cars, there was chaos. Then suddenly there was an announcement, men on one side, women on the other side. And slowly that line moved forward. And as the line moved forward, I began to see towards the end an elegant-looking SS officer dressed in a beautiful leather coat with a cap, and he made a motion with his hand. Up to the right, down to the left. We didn't know what that motion meant. Up, you lived, down, you died. I was lucky. I was a young kid at that time. I could work.
And who was that man?
That man, I was told later, I didn't know it at that time, was Dr. Josef Mengele.
And he told us to lay face down. And the next thing I knew, that they were, sort of like checking my spinal area, my vertebrae area, and I felt a very sharp instrument. And then the next thing, I just fought to keep my consciousness. And I whispered to my little twin sister, just bear with it.
What happened to you?
For about half an hour, I felt paralyzed, but I could hear voices, and I heard him say that the fluid is not clear enough, and we'll have to try it again.
What was done to you?
I was 12 years old. I was a guinea pig. I was a Jewish child. I never asked. If you want.
What was done to your sister?
The same exact thing. And then.
What effects were there on you?
Well, I had since then multiple surgery. I was 90% paralyzed. I know for a fact that I could never bend forward, never mind bending back.
It's been 40 years since Dr. Josef Mengele, a doctor of medicine, student of philosophy, and the angel of death, walked away from Auschwitz to the place where he attempted to play God, deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands of people, the place where during the day he tortured and maimed, indifferent to the cries and the pleas, and the place where during the night he settled in to listen to music, sensitive to its sounds and cantillation. And now, 40 years later, the world is still searching for Josef Mengele. Mr. Chairman, we are searching for him now, not because he was so clever in escaping, but because we were so remiss in allowing him to escape. Not because we could not find Josef Mengele, but because the truth is we have not invested enough energy and the necessary resources to really look for him.
Those haunting questions are what is behind both the Senate inquiry and the involvement of the U.S. Justice Department in the Mengele case. Jim?
Some perspective on the search for Mengele now from Alan Ryan. He was in charge of the U.S. efforts to find Nazi war criminals as director of the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations from 1979 to 83. He wrote a recently published book on the subject called Quiet Neighbors, Prosecuting War Criminals in America. He is now in the private practice of law. Mr. Allen, first, do you believe Mengele is still alive?
I do, Jim. I think there have been enough recent reports that we can assume he is still alive.
Assume? I mean, is that...
He might have died last week, but I think the best information that we have is that he's still alive.
Why has he not been found and arrested or something done with him up till now?
Well, at least in recent years, from, say, 1960 onward, he was living in Paraguay under the official protection of the government of Paraguay, and he lived in great physical security behind barriers that made it very difficult for anyone to approach. That official protection has ended, but...
I mean, there was no question he was there or whatever, right?
No, I don't think there was any question.
Okay. All right.
The official protection has ended. The question is, does unofficial protection exist? And I think the answer to that question will come when we see how fully the government of Paraguay cooperates with the Justice Department in its investigation that was announced last week.
What's your own view of that?
I don't know. I don't know.
You think he's still in Paraguay?
I think the most likely hypothesis is that he is either in Paraguay or in Brazil or in that area that where they come together down there in the jungles of South America. I don't have any inside information, and I'm not investigating Mengele as such, but I think the information that has come to light suggests that that's where he is now.
Do you think he's under the protection of governments, or do you think he's under the protection of some kind of network of private folks, or what?
I think it might be a combination of both factors. I can't say that he's under the protection of any government, but will the government of Paraguay cooperate fully, or will they simply say, good luck, but we're not going to help you? If it's the latter response, then in a way it's an unofficial protection, because looking for someone in Paraguay is not like going into the streets of New York or Chicago. It's a jungle, and unless the United States government has the cooperation of the governments down there, Paraguay, Argentina, where Mengele lived for many years in the 50s, and its neighbors, and unless it has the cooperation of European governments in generating information, I think the chances of success are smaller than they otherwise would be.
What is the unofficial network that protects people like Mengele?
Well, it's hard separating fact from fiction. There is, or at least there was, a network of former Nazi agents in South America, because many
That's the Odessa group?
The Odessa group. Many of the regimes down there welcomed former Nazis, particularly if they had one of two things: money or expertise in security police operations. For example, Klaus Barbie was an advisor to the government of Bolivia, to the military dictatorship in Bolivia for many years, because he was very good at secret police techniques, which are in much greater demand down there than they are in this country. Those former Nazi criminals are still there, if they are still alive, and I think Mengele probably comes in under the first category, that of money, because I don't think he had the skills or the information to operate as a security.
He would have no value to them, you don't think?
No, that's one of the questions I think that's been raised here. Did he ever work for American intelligence after the war? I don't know, but I'm highly skeptical, because this guy spent the war as a torturer and a demented doctor in a death camp in Auschwitz. I am absolutely at a loss to understand what possible information or skills he could have, even putting aside the moral question, that would have made him of any value to anybody's intelligence service. So I'm very skeptical of that possibility. The question of whether he was in U.S. custody, I think, remains to be seen. There have been a few reports suggesting that he has, but so far those reports have come from people who didn't really know Mengele. They were just told that this man they saw was Mengele. So I think we have to wait and see what the Justice Department investigation shows on that score as well.
Is it only the Justice Department that would be, the U.S. Justice Department, as a result of 2 weeks now, that is looking for him suddenly, or somebody else been looking for him all this time too?
Well, there's been a number of people that have been looking for him. I mean, Simon Wiesenthal in Vienna has received reports from time to time saying that his people are just on the trail of Mengele and so forth.
What about the Israelis?
It's very hard to say what the Israelis have been doing. I would not be surprised if they said they had been looking for him, but they're not going to say that. I think they're going to be very close-mouthed about it. I think one of the points that has to be made in these most recent events is it's good that the United States has announced this investigation. The United States has considerable resources that make success more likely. But it is not something that ought to be limited to the United States. I think that West Germany, I think that the United Kingdom, I think the Soviet Union, any government, any allied government, particularly after the war, may have had information on Mengele, and I think that ought to be shared.
Mr. Ryan, finally, what do you think the odds are on finding him?
I have to believe that the odds are worth the effort. I have to be that much of an optimist. But I don't think anyone can say it will succeed. The only honest answer to that is we don't know. But is it worth undertaking, knowing what we know? Yes, I think so.
Alan Ryan, thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Finally, tonight, an update on the investigation of Nazi fugitive Josef Mengele. Forensic experts in Brazil say they are close to concluding their examination of the skeletal remains of a body believed to be Mengele's. The chief investigator in the case said today that everything points to a positive identification of the Nazi doctor who had reportedly lived in Paraguay and Brazil following his escape from post-war Europe. Mengele was known as the Angel of Death, accused of sending 400,000 people to their deaths during World War II. Special correspondent John Arden filed this report on the progress of the investigation in Brazil.
For 12 years, undisturbed by the world, Josef Mengele apparently lived here in the Brazilian countryside, working as a caretaker for a Hungarian family. A neighbor who remembers him retraces his steps in the foothills of Serra Negra, 100 miles from São Paulo. Mengele was remembered as a man who said very little and was suspicious of strangers. During his time here, Mengele helped build this observation tower and spent hours surveying the surrounding countryside with a pair of binoculars. His neighbor, Ferdinando Bellatati, said Mengele seemed to care only for his dogs, a pack of 15 mongrels.
He used to give them injections when they were sick. He cured them. But if he was asked by someone to help with a medical problem outside the cottage, he never went. Because he never left here, nobody ever saw this man. Nobody ever saw this man in this neighborhood.
What seems surprising is that while he was in Brazil, no one wanted to denounce him, even when they knew who he was. The Hungarian woman he worked for, Gita Stammer, said he was hard to get rid of.
That's why we did everything to make him go away. But it was very difficult because no one wanted him. He always said, patience, patience, wait a little more. But nothing worked out. When people knew what it was about, they got frightened. We didn't want to denounce him.
Paraguay was a haven for all types of criminals, and there was no special objection to ex-Nazis. Mengele went to Paraguay in the early 50s when his first refuge in Argentina looked dangerous. President General Stroessner, Latin America's longest surviving dictator, was surrounded by generals highly influenced by Nazi doctrine. Mengele didn't even change his name when he took up residence in Asunción under the benevolent eye of the president. With his naturalization papers in order, Mengele went to the south of Paraguay to live near Encarnación, a sleepy area just across the river from Argentina and already heavily settled by German immigrants. An Auschwitz victim, Emil Wolf, who runs a small delicatessen in Asunción, recalls a scene with Mengele.
Mengele, when I had my business in the restaurant in 53, that he was coming every morning to have his coffee. But I did not know it was Mengele.
How did you find out?
Some friends of me told me. You do not know whom was here in your business. No, whom was that? That was Mengele.
And if he came today to ask you for a coffee, what would you do?
I kill him.
20 years later, these photos provided by his Austrian friends, Wolfram and Lissalette Bossert, purport to show Mengele as he was in Brazil. It was the Bosserts who were with Mengele when he's alleged to have drowned on this beach at Bertioga, not far from São Paulo. A lifeguard who dragged him from the surf remembers that Mrs. Bossert seemed very scared when their friend suffered a stroke in the water.
She was very scared. She cried a lot. She clutched the body. I have never seen anyone in 19 years of service clutch a body like that.
Mengele had already moved to the city before he died, where his maid Elsa had a close relationship with him.
He was not sad when we were here. He wasn't sad, but he didn't like being alone. He felt very alone when the workers went home. And when I went home, he used to accompany me all the way. He would say, "I'm not going to stay alone. I don't like staying alone. I'm going to accompany you." He used to do a lot of walking around the streets. Alone.
Outside São Paulo's medical institute, news people have been elbowing each other daily in the search for confirmation that Mengele really died. São Paulo's federal police chief, Romeo Tuma, says investigations are now being held to know if there was any organization behind the protection of Mengele. The head of São Paulo's large Jewish community, Rabbi Henry Sobel, thinks there is.
A Nazi underground, a Nazi infrastructure in Brazil, Nazis protecting Nazis, sheltering Nazis, providing funds for Nazis. This was confirmed to us in 1978 when we discovered a congress in Itatiaia where 16 people came from all parts of the world, and they chose Brazil as a central address. And these Nazis came to talk about the good old times with Adolf Hitler.
The findings announced by the scientists working on the case will never be sufficient to convince the skeptics.
I mean, whether the bones are Mengele's or not, everybody's talking about Mengele and the Holocaust. That's what the world Jewish community has been aiming at all along. So I think we've accomplished our purpose. We don't want to look back. We want to look forward. We don't want another Holocaust. Never again.
That report from Brazil was filed by Special Correspondent John Arden. He was the most notorious Nazi war criminal still at large, the mad doctor who conducted grotesque experiments on children and sent over 400,000 innocent victims to their deaths. He was Josef Mengele, the angel of death of the Auschwitz concentration camp. And today, a group of scientists declared that he is, with all reasonable scientific certainty, dead. Charlene Hunter-Galt has more. Charlene?
Judy, for the last week, scientists from Brazil, Germany, and the United States have been studying the bones of a man who drowned and was buried under a false name 6 years ago. Today, they issued a preliminary report on their findings. I talked this afternoon with one of the American scientists on the team in Sao Paulo. He is Clyde Snow, an anthropologist specializing in forensic medicine at the University of Oklahoma. We asked what the investigators meant when they said they had reasonable scientific certainty that the remains were Mengele's.
This is the same level of confidence and proof that we would use if we were asked to testify as an expert witness in a court case and present our findings as evidence which would hold up in a court of law.
So basically, in your mind and those of your fellow scientists, there is no doubt that this is Josef Mengele?
There's no doubt in our minds.
Before you left the United States, you were very critical of the way the body had been exhumed and handled. What has since changed your mind about all that?
Well, my mind hasn't changed about the method of exhumation, and I hope I didn't embarrass. I didn't mean to imply that this was a Brazilian problem, because we have the same difficulty in the United States when people who are not trained as archaeologists exhume or excavate buried skeletons. Down here, in this case, there was some damage to the facial bones of the skeleton that, however, we could repair and restore. In other words, we could reconstruct the skull from the fragments with a very high degree of precision.
Was there any key piece of evidence or pieces of evidence that were absolutely conclusive that took you over the edge of doubt?
Well, I would say that there was no single piece of critical or key evidence. What we're looking at is a total array of small pieces of information, some of them of varying types. For example, the anthropological information that he was consistent in terms of age, sex, race, stature, even whether or not he was right-handed, and other features of that sort.
Were there any
dental evidence?
Sorry, go ahead.
The dental evidence available on Dr. Josef Mengele is consistent with the dental findings. Then there are many other features here. For example, the West German police showed us their analysis of the photographs of the man who was living here under the name Gerhardt, and their comparison of Gerhardt's photographs with those taken on Josef Mengele. And they were able to point out 24 significant details of matching. Well, this almost takes it, that single piece of evidence could take it almost to the limit of beyond reasonable doubt. The other technique that was used, also performed by our West German colleagues, which I think is probably the most impressive single piece of evidence that we examined, was the skull-face superimposition. This technique consists of taking the skull and training a camera on it and another on the photograph, the test photograph of the individual, then taking the two images and putting them into a special effects blender and displaying them on a single television monitor. And the German team have developed this technique to a very high technology, and so looking at the skull and the face, the anatomical conformity of the skull and the face was extremely impressive in that, based on my experience, I would say that not one out of, certainly not more than 1 out of 100 people would have such similar skulls, and perhaps much less than that.
What about the teeth? You mentioned that a few moments ago. Did you have the old dental records of Mengele's from World War II to compare with what you examined?
Right, and unfortunately this is not an ideal dental record in that it consisted of the dental chart with simple indications that each tooth had been filled or removed with no indication as the shape or type of filling. But the teeth that are shown in that chart that are still in the mouth or in the jaws of this skull are consistent from that standpoint.
Let me just ask you this. There are those who feel that it's possible that friends could have tampered with those kinds of records. There are also those who have suggested that Dr. Mengele was so expert a scientist himself that he could have arranged the bones and other details to mimic his own body. Are there any, what do you think the chances of something like that happening are?
I think we have conclusively ruled out the possibility of a hoax.
So in your mind, does this close the book, or do you think that other leads should be followed up?
Well, I would like to see the investigations continue to, for example, perhaps bring to light other medical or dental records which would, serve to confirm our findings here.
Right. But as far as you're
concerned, that if they're found, they will confirm our findings.
Is today's report from Brazil going to close the book on the search for Mengele? We get two views now from two men who have been involved in the hunt for escaped Nazis. The first is John Loftus, a lawyer formerly with the Justice Department, who wrote a book on Nazi war criminals in the United States. He joins us tonight from public station WGBH in Boston. And in Los Angeles, we have Rabbi Marvin Heyer, Dean of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Rabbi Heyer's group sponsored the trip of Professor Snow and the other Americans to Brazil. Mr. Loftus, let me begin with you. We've just heard Mr. Snow, the anthropologist, say that he now has no doubt that these remains are those of Josef Mengele. Do you agree?
Well, I think after 4 funerals for Mengele, it's wise to approach these cases with a great deal of skepticism. I heard tapes of the other forensic experts today say that they thought it was highly probable that Mengele was dead. I think it's time to put a few facts in here. This was an identification made without fingerprints, without dental films, without x-rays, without a photograph of the body, with virtually none of the benchmarks that forensic experts rely upon to conclusively establish the identity of a particular corpse. Coincidentally, none of the usual standards were available to them. I think that what we have here is a unanimous opinion that this probably is Mengele, with some of the experts being more emphatic than others. But what's been missing here is that part of their conclusion is based not on forensic material at all, but on the fact that some of Mengele's papers and clothing and photographs were found on the scene.
Now, wait a minute. What we heard Mr. Snow say, however, was that the most impressive evidence was the shape of the skull, the teeth, the consistency of the dental records, and so forth.
Well, in a strictly legalistic sense, much of the West German technology is not accepted in American courts. It's not been proven to be scientifically valid. And I think that the expert you just mentioned admitted that, there's one chance in 100 that other people would have the same skulls as Mengele. That identification alone does not establish the case.
All right. Let's turn to Rabbi Heyer in Los Angeles. What is your view after hearing what the evidence was that came out today?
Well, let me say to begin with that we were amongst the biggest skeptics in the Mengele case. We know all of the hoaxes and the purposely misleading disinformation campaign that Nazis have led us on a trail for the last 20 years. But let me say that I was impressed with the unanimous decision of the forensic experts, the fact that they left little doubt that they believed in high probability that this was Mengele. A few serious questions remain, and we intend to pursue those questions. Amongst them, the refusal of the Mengele family to honor a commitment that they made to the German prosecutor to reveal intimate medical details about Dr. Mengele. Yesterday, because of a telegram that we sent to Chief of Police Tuma, I understand that Ralph Mengele came in with his attorney for an interview with the prosecutor in West Germany. When he was asked about the medical data, he replied that all he could say is that Dr. Mengele never limped. As far as the war wounds are concerned, he did not remember which side or specifically what the war wounds were. Now, it's strange that both of Mengele's wives, Martha and Irene, have not come forward. They certainly know the specifics of the wounds, but have remained silent. So that is one thing that bothers us.
So your view is that while some of this evidence is impressive, you need more information.
We believe that we should see the evidence in its entirety before formally making a declaration that the case is closed.
What did impress you briefly about what you've heard today?
The fact that, for example, Dr. Mengele had two empty white spaces between teeth. In the dental chart, they were the fourth teeth on both sides of the mouth. Now, I understand from Dr. Snow and from Dr. Levine that a measurement of the skull in that area showed that the space appeared in exactly the same area has the 1938 dental charts of Mengele's SS records.
All right, let me stop you there. Mr. Loftus, what about that? Does that make any difference as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think it's entirely possible that this is Mengele's skull. Possible. Not established beyond a reasonable doubt. Because those records we're talking about are paper records, more than 40 years old, that are being compared against 7 teeth. It's not unlikely that if you were a Nazi physician with a $3 million price in your head and a great experience in skulls, that you'd look around and found one that was reasonably similar.
What would it take to persuade you?
I think that the facts would have to fit. One of the problems here is the government of Paraguay for the last 20 years has been saying Mengele is in our country and we refuse to extradite him. Now we're being asked to believe that Mengele lived in Brazil for those 20 years. Was the entire Paraguayan government and President Stroessner pulling a hoax on the Western diplomatic corps?
You think he's still alive, is what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that we don't finally know. I hope that Mengele is dead, because I think he was kind of a media Nazi. Then maybe we should turn our attention more to the second and third tier Nazis, the networks that cared for Mengele and people like him for the last 40 years. Who were the people that protected them, and how did they get away with it for so long?
Mr. Heyer, would you agree with that approach?
Well, let me say that it's interesting that in Brazil, 3 of the most notorious Nazi war criminals, Gustav Wagner, the commandant of Treblinka, and now Josef Mengele, were all found in the same country, in Brazil. That suggests that there is a Nazi network, but it was operating in Brazil. And we're certainly going to investigate the entire German colony in Brazil to see if there are any more Nazi war criminals hiding there.
So the search does not end in any respect with today's report. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, not at all. As a matter of fact, one thing should be clear about the Mengele case. If the same interest that now exists in the Mengele case worldwide was in evidence 15 years ago, Josef Mengele would have been picked up in 48 hours. Josef Mengele was no master Houdini, and he was not a master escape artist. He managed to stay clear of everyone for one reason. Nobody was looking for him. The only exception were Nazi hunters. The German government did a very poor job in looking for Mengele. An example of that is... Yes?
I was just going to say we need to wrap it up, but go ahead and finish your thought.
I was just saying that there was no undercover agent ever placed in the field. Seidelmeyer's telephone was never tapped. No letters were opened, which was an indication of with what seriousness they approached the Mengele case.
Rabbi Heyer and Mr. Loftus, we thank you both for joining us. Charlene?
A reaction now from someone who personally suffered at the hands of Josef Mengele. She is Isabella Leitner, a New York writer who survived Auschwitz and has written 2 books about her experience. Ms. Leitner, under what circumstances did you know Josef Mengele?
I was taken to Auschwitz from Hungary I arrived on May 31st, 1944. The first torturer I met was Mengele, who found my mother at the age of 49 too old to live in his superior wisdom, and my sister at 13 and a half too young to live, and he sent them to be burned. I suspect my youngest sister was burned alive in an open fire, because when the Hungarian Jews were brought into Auschwitz, the crematoriums were too busy to accommodate all the bodies. And I was sent with my sister to the life site, but the very same Mengele who killed my mother and sister. And all he did was one to the life side, one to burning. He whistled my sister and I with the words I will always remember: Die zwei, these two.
How did you manage to get away from him all the time that you did?
Subsequently, I spent the entire summer with my 3 sisters. There were 4 of us in Lager C. The entire summer of 1944, I spent trying to escape Mengele's selections with my 3 sisters.
How did you do
I
that?
hasten to say that. I must add here with considerable bitterness that had the, and no pun intended, had the president, if the president had to run from Mengele's burning desire to burn him the way I had to run all of the summer of 1944, I'm certain he would not have gone to Bitburg and cause us this dreadful pain.
You and your sisters would be in a dormitory, and you somehow
There was
managed
no
to get away
dormitory.
as...
If you have the time, I will explain it to you, that Lager C, which housed the Hungarian girls in particular, consisted of 32 blocks. Blocks were the barracks, and they were numbered 9, 10, 11, 12. Each barrack held ostensibly 1,000 skeletons, which we were rendered skeletons very soon after our arrival.
Excuse me, but your sister was injected, was she not, with typhus?
My sister was injected with typhus, and by Mengele, and she survived it. One night, unexpectedly, Mengele came in to Lager C and made a selection, and we escaped through the back door of the barrack, and he shot after us, and he didn't get us in the dark.
Let me just ask you this, finally, your own reaction to the news from the scientists that Mengele is dead.
I hope I can have the privilege of being the last skeptic in the world to accept any, I don't want to quarrel with the scientists, but Nazi reassurances such as the couple who hid him for all those years and their word that he drowned, and the whole Nazi network that is so well and alive and will remain alive after Mengele, because I think the Mengele circus will be over and the Nazis will be forgotten again, as Mengele was forgotten for 40 years. Only we remember him, and for me, Mengele will never die. He lives in every bloodstream of mine, and he lives in the owlish night of my tortured dreams, and when I'm haunted by the millions, by the hundreds of thousands he sent to their death. He's alive for me until the day I die.
Well, thank you very much for coming and being with us.